Thank you. Quite an introduction. It's good to be able to address you all at this inaugural Vision China event. One of my jobs at China Daily is to connect with those who write and express views about China from abroad and the world. So I want to speak to you tonight about the reaction of sinologists and other experts about China's new era. I particularly want to include the views of those from the developing world, especially Africa, because their perspective is perhaps the most fundamental to all of this. I was very fortunate to actually be in the Great Hall of the People when President Xi Jinping made his report to the 19th CPC National Congress in October. I was reporting on the event for one of 3 cover stories I did for China Daily's overseas editions on the Congress meeting, the covers of which are shown here behind me. There was a sense or a buzz in the Great Hall of having witnessed something historic, aside from the extraordinary length of Xi's speech itself, which, as you know, was nearly 3.5 hours. So what did this new era mean? The immediate reaction to Xi's report was that China's new era was a new and confident China striding forward into a world that it itself would play a large part in shaping. In the 40 years after reform and opening up, from the late 1970s onwards, China was largely in the catch-up phase. The focus was on the economy, and China was content to operate in a Western global order. China, however, was now moving onto the next stage in its development, which would play a more central role. This was not intended in any way as a threat to the West. It was just a statement of reality. China is the world's second largest economy, the world's largest manufacturer and exporter. The sheer numbers of China's vast and fast-growing middle class is evident wherever you go in the world. Chinese tourists are everywhere, and Chinese students provide vital income for universities in the US, the UK, or elsewhere. China, too, now has its own major, truly global initiative in Belt and Road. China's very size and status meant there has to be some sort of change. One of the first experts I spoke to after the report was delivered was Martin Jakes, the British author and academic who comes very much from the Marxist tradition in terms of his thinking. I happened to be at the launch of his now famous book, When China Rules the World, at the Hay Book Festival in Wales in 2009. The book had been described as silly by none other than Chris Patten, the former governor of Hong Kong. After Xi's report, the book, however, seemed immediately prescient and a vindication of Jakes' ideas. This was not necessarily because China was about to take over the world anytime soon, but because Xi's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era was a solid defense of China's system. Jakes said, and I quote, "Xi wanted to underscore the fact that the Chinese economy is not gravitating toward capitalism. It is not going to end up as a Western-style economy or a Western-style polity. It is going to remain profoundly different. And in that sense, it remains firmly in a socialist rather than a capitalist tradition." There was other reaction. Peter Frankopan, professor of global history at Oxford University, said Xi had managed to present a unified global vision. Frankopan, for those who don't know, is also the author of the excellent best-selling book, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, and is one who certainly sees the significance of China's Belt and Road Initiative. He said, and I quote again, "When you are in Beijing, the old world represented by the United States and Britain in particular, looks highly divided. There are conflicting views of what the direction of travel should be. What Xi has been very careful to do over the last few years is set out a grand vision, and it is now all about getting behind that vision and putting the shoulder to the grindstone to make sure it is deliverable. Rana Mitter, director of the University of Oxford China Centre, said that what Xi was doing was putting China front and center in world affairs. He added a note of caution, however, and said that this was not going to be straightforward for China, since what went with it would be a new series of responsibilities, such as opening up its market and taking positions on local and global security, as well as climate change. One of the interesting parts of Xi's report was the long-term goals. As Xi said in his report, we must work with resolve and tenacity and write a brilliant chapter on our new journey to socialist modernization. In his speech, Xi set a new staging post target for China's development. This will be 2035. By 2035, China has set itself the aim to become a global leader in innovation, have more equal rights for citizens, see improvements in the rule of law, have increased soft power, better public services, and there's also this goal of creating what Xi called a beautiful China relating to the environment, but also with a broader meaning with historical and cultural connotations. The 2049 target for China's modernization to be complete in time for the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. This we already had. By then, China is aiming to become a global leader in terms of national strength and international influence. There will be common prosperity for everyone, and Chinese people will enjoy safer and healthier lives. The most immediate target, though, is 2020, the aim to double China's 2010 GDP per capita within what is now just 2 years. By doing so, China will become a moderately well-off society and effectively break out of the middle income trap in time for the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CPC in 2021. With China reporting 6.9% growth for 2017 last week, the first year it has accelerated since 2010, this now looks comfortably achievable, although that wasn't always the case. One thing a number of people have observed about the longer-term targets is there are no numbers attached. What they have taken from that is that China, in future, is to focus on the quality rather than the quantity of its growth. Zhu Ning, ocean-wide professor of finance at Tsinghua University, believes moving away from growth targets is actually setting out a new vision for development and thinks that as a result, that China will grow more sustainably in the long term. New Era is also very much about poverty reduction. Xi, in his report, stressed the target of eliminating extreme rural poverty in China by 2020. This was also emphasized at an Africa-China high-level dialogue and think tank forum attended in Addis Ababa in June last year, where there's a lot of interest in Xi's book, Up and Out of Poverty. The book records the time that Xi was party chief of Ningde prefecture of Fujian province in the late 1980s and his efforts to tackle poverty then. One of the defining aspects of Xi's approach to reducing poverty is to shake off what he describes as a poverty mentality, to instill in people a self-belief, as well as putting the right policies in place. He's also against grandiose projects or initiatives which might not deliver any real benefits. This brings us to an important aspect of China's new direction. To what extent is China's new era relevant to the rest of the world? Jakes, the British author and academic, says China, although with more than a foot in the developed world, is now without question the leader of the developing world, and as such is seen as a role model. He says this is more difficult for the developed world. The view there has been that China is not like us and is therefore not going to make it. I think it's important to make a distinction here, however, between a role model and an economic model. I spoke to a number of African journalists at the Congress meeting, and they had a range of views on this. Bukola Jasmine Ogosina, chief correspondent of Leadership, a Nigerian newspaper, said it was important that China wasn't forcing its own particular model of development in Africa, and in Nigeria's case, it was better it found its own model of development and did not just copy either Asian or Western models. Yazina Faneka-April, a research specialist at the Africa Institute of South Africa, says the difficulty for Africa is that China's model depends on having a strong state. Africa, as a continent, is host to many weak states, she says, which would find it difficult to replicate. There are exceptions, however. For Ethiopia, whose ruling party has strong links with the CPC, China's model of development is already something of a blueprint. If you travel just 30 miles outside of Addis Ababa, you arrive at the Eastern Industrial Park, home to Huajian, the Chinese shoemaker, and an industrial zone which looks like a piece of China transplanted to the African continent. Getachew Yalo, an Ethiopian journalist at the Congress, said that Ethiopia had managed to deliver some 23 million people out of poverty in 2 decades by following China's approach. It had carried out agricultural reform and built a manufacturing base, something that is right out of the Reform and Opening Up copybook. 3 months on from the report and the launch of New Era, the ideas still resonate. Earlier this month, I conducted a series of interviews in London, including one with former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. He was, of course, in office when Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. He's been a regular visitor to China ever since and has frequently made the point that many in the West simply don't get China. He said Xi's report was interesting from a number of important angles, but it indicated more than anything that China now had the ambition to go on to the next stage, where it would have big significance in the world. The rise of China, he says, is the biggest single geopolitical change of the 21st century. There is virtually no problem in the world that can be resolved without China. We are left with a question as to how actually historic could New Era prove to be. Xi, in his report, made many historical references. He talked of China's 5,000 years of civilization and about how China was less than 2 centuries ago one of the world's greatest ever powers. Then, however, came the Opium Wars and China's century of humiliation before Mao reasserted China's national pride in 1949. One of the boldest interpretations of New Era is whether it challenges existing concepts of modernity itself. In the West, we are all very used to the idea that Western modernity is the finished product and the only type of modernity available. Take it or leave it. But when you think about Western modernity as we know it now, it perhaps dates back to the Enlightenment that spread through the Europe of the early 18th century. These ideas were embodied in the industrial revolutions that began in Britain and then through Europe to the United States. In the context of Chinese history, this is not a long time. One of Jake's contentions is that Western modernity is not the eternal concept we assume in the West, and far from a universal model. In his view, New Era is the beginning of a representation of Chinese modernity and the benefits that that it can bring. But this is perhaps too big a question for now. In conclusion, some parts of New Era are yet to be defined, yet it is about China entering the next stage of its domestic development and taking a more central role on the world stage. What we know from Xi's report is that New Era as a concept is intended from the outset to be significant. Thank you.